I genuinely hope that I live to see this day, the day when the initial exploration of Mars is completed, the unmanned starships that have deployed 3D printed habitats have already done their job, delivered the necessary supplies, building materials, etc., and now people are on their way to the red planet not to explore, but to colonize. But given that Starship is going to be these people's home for the next 6 months, I think it's worth asking, what kind of home is this really going to be? Can 100 people really be crammed into 1,100 square meters worth of space? It does sound like an awful lot, but at the same time, when you compare it to the amount of space that only four or so astronauts have on the ISS, it's pretty damn cramped. Now, of course, cramped quarters are something that we human beings have been very accustomed to during colonization. The colonists, for example, on the Mayflower were very closely packed together, although not all of them survived. What would it be like to be a colonist on Starship? And even more importantly, how many people can we realistically fit on this vessel and have a realistic chance of survival? Now, granted, the pressurized volume inside Starship dwarfs that of ISS, but we must remember that only 242 astronauts have visited ISS and lived there over the course of its entire history, nearly 21 years. So, by the time Mars comes into view of these weary travelers after a 6 month journey, can we really expect 100 of them to have survived? Can we really expect that 100 of them would have attempted the trip in the first place? Or must we go with a smaller number, a number that some think is more realistic? Well, I've spent a lot of time trying to consider how much you can do with 1,100 cubic meters, and even though it sounds like a hell of a lot, by the time you get to the end of a 6 month journey, it gets to be pretty damn small. How small? Well, perhaps not as tiny as some may have supposed, but then again, not as enormous as many of us would like to imagine. So, how many people are we talking about? And how would we maximize their chances of survival? Well, I'm going to explore all of this in just a few moments. Good evening, and welcome to another episode of The Angry Astronaut. So, my final recorded episode, at least for now, from the state of Colorado. I am very excited to be making this journey to New Mexico to see Spaceship Two or VSS Unity take flight with Sir Richard Branson on board. And with it, there is a whole lot of media frenzy going on, obviously in terms of what appears to be a contest of billionaires, a race to suborbital space, or whatever you want to call it. But in Sir Richard's defense, it was always his intention to fly this year on one of the final test flights of VSS Unity in order to prove that this ship was going to be safe for future passengers to travel on, for commercial passengers. So honestly, thought that that was sort of a noble thing, initially, that, he would fly first to prove that this was safe, that he would take the risk himself first before he asked anybody else to do it. In my opinion, that kind of sets him apart a little bit from Jeff Bezos, who's going up with a couple of other civilians in addition to himself. So there are others taking the risk. But at the same time, I think honestly that New Shepard is hardly a risk. It's proven itself to be highly reliable and extremely safe, as opposed to, of course, Spaceship Two, which had that tragic accident quite a number of years ago now. But still, the FAA has approved this vessel, so I am very excited. What happens in the next few days is going to be extremely important to the future of Virgin Galactic and to the future of space tourism. But enough about that. Let's talk about Starship. There's been a lot of debate about the internal layout of Starship and, how many passengers could it really carry if we're talking about settlers and we're not talking about, explorers, that sort of thing. Is could it really carry 100 people? Well, as usual, I look to historical precedents rather than, coming up with some sort of design to where we could cram the maximum number of people inside in theory. Instead, I like to look at what's been done in the past. And for this particular example, I am looking to Salyut 6. Now, this was by no means a luxurious space station at all. And however, it was occupied by Russian crews for as long as 6 months at a time. So I think it's a very good example of how many cubic meters of pressurized space people need in order to be able to sustain themselves over a 6 month period of time. And well, not exactly comfort. I wouldn't say that they had a comfortable experience at all on Salyut 6. Nothing compared to what the astronauts experience on the ISS. But still, I think it is a very good example of what is possible. Starship can handle 1,100 cubic meters of pressurized space. So we are essentially looking at 33 or so people. Let's call it 3 dozen. That's the assumption that I'm going to be going on based on what's been done in the past. Cramming triple the number of people into, per cubic meter than the Russians accomplished on Salyut 6, I think is an unrealistic expectation. I think, Starship can carry 100 people from place to place if they ever get that whole system of, spot to spot on Earth. Yeah, that's very possible. 100 people to the moon. Yeah, that's not a very long journey at all. That's something that Starship could easily handle. But 100 people, 6 months, all the way to Mars, plus everything that they're going to need to survive, I really doubt it. I really do. I would say 3 dozen is about the maximum, and even that is going to be pushing it. And as you're going to see here shortly, my emphasis is going to be on minimizing the amount of space that each person has to themselves, because honestly, I think that is secondary to the things that they are going to need in order to be able to survive. Maximizing the use of space wherever possible, and also wherever possible, using the same space for multiple purposes. What am I talking about? Well, you're going to find out right now. First of all, when we're considering the amount of water, food, other necessities that are required by our colonists, we must not make the mistake of comparing them to ISS astronauts. Their daily routine is insane. Not just in terms of exercise, but also in terms of maintaining the space station, carrying out their daily requirements of scientific experiments, etc. All of these things make a day-to-day astronaut's routine very difficult and requires a lot more calories and a lot more water than the average individual who's simply waiting to get to Mars. This, by the way, is a remote piloted drone from Draper, designed to track and study the behavior of astronauts inside the ISS in order to determine what they really are going to require in terms of volume in order to be able to survive. Now, even though ISS astronauts are supposed to restrict their water usage to about 11 liters per day, this is not what is required. According to the U.S. National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, they determined that an adequate fluid intake is 3.7 liters of fluid per day for men and 2.7 liters per women. Now, for reasons that I'm going to explain later, I'm going to increase this daily intake to 6.4 liters per day because people need water for things other than just basic consumption and for other purposes. And I'm going to multiply that by our 36 crewmen and come up with 230.4 liters worth of water per day in terms of intake. Now let's assume that you have a system that has a 95% recycling efficiency. We don't have something like that on the ISS right now, but we do have a system called Melissa being developed by the ESA that can do that or better. But let's just assume 95%, which means the water would need to be changed out 9 times. So you're looking at 9 times 230.4 liters, or over 2,000 liters worth of water for a 6-month trip. That also is 2 metric tons of your 100 metric tons gone just for water. Now, food is a far more difficult consideration, at least if you want to keep people healthy. By the time people are reaching Mars, if you want them to be still standing, they need to be consuming an average of about 2 kilograms worth of food per day. Once again, far less than what astronauts consume, but still very manageable. But what about growing your own food? Well, the problem is, it turns out that the necessary plant life required to grow enough food to sustain a human being requires far more water than that human being needs. So you trade one mass requirement off for another. At least in the initial stages, the vast majority of the food is going to have to be prepackaged. But not too bad of news. We're looking at about 13 metric tons worth of food for the entire journey, and that once again is for 36 people. And then, of course, there's the weight of the colonists themselves. Now, personally, I'm going to go with the European average weight simply because, well, they're just healthier than us North Americans. It's plain and simple. The average weight of a European adult is 70.8 kilograms, and a healthy colonist will weigh about the same. So 70.8 times 36 colonists, and you come out to about 2.54 metric tons. You see how much more difficult this gets with 3 times the colonists? I mean, with 100, you would have consumed more than half your 100 metric tons, and that's just in terms of food, water, and the mass of the colonists, to say nothing of the atmosphere, life support equipment, gym equipment, other things that are going to be needed for this travel. So really, that's why I think this number is more realistic. So that being the case, let's take a quick look inside. Now, this, in my opinion, is one of the best interior designs for Starship that's ever been created, and it was created by British interior architect and designer Paul King, and all of his links are in the description, and he generously allowed me to use his blueprints, and let me tell you something, I love them. It has a total of 7 different levels. The 6 levels designed for habitation are 2.5 meters high, allowing for the vast majority of humans to safely operate. And strangely enough, I'm going to start on level 4, where the crew cabins are, or we can't call them cabins. They're actually pods. And as you can see, with the entire diameter of this thing only being 9 meters, these things are very, very small. We're talking Japanese style living here. And by the way, each of these pods are only designed for one person, so a crew of 20 people. Now, if you want 40 or 36 or whatever I was talking about, then people are going to have to work in 2 shifts, which would be a good idea anyway, and I'll bring that up in a little bit. But once again, just have a quick look at these things. They are tiny, and that's important because space for individual crew members needs to be minimized to make room for everything else. And yet, each pod does come with some important luxuries. A window onto space, first of all, which I think is absolutely crucial. And why the hell do you need a chair in space? Well, this is a multifunctional chair that can actually be used for launch as well as a functional purpose once the Starship sets down on Mars. And so you have a pod that can essentially contain a settler without him ever having to leave. So here you have a cutaway of the top 3 levels. You have the flight deck, and then you have the common area, and then the area with the crew pods, all of which have access to windows, especially the common area and the flight deck. That huge window that comes under so much criticism. In my opinion, it can be done from an engineering standpoint, and I've seen this from what Axiom Space intends to do with their windows, and on top of that, there's just so much help that can be provided from a psychiatric standpoint from being able to see out into space and to see your destination. So here's the flight deck itself. I'm not sure if it's going to require this many people, but they have their own launch seats for initial takeoff and landing, along with the necessary controls for navigation and other purposes. And here's the mess hall / common area. I don't know how often the retractable tables would be used, as these sorts of things are not altogether necessary if you have dehydrated food. It also has space for food storage, although not enough given the number of tons of food we've been talking about, but still, there's going to be space for that on other levels. Once again, minimum amount of personal space, maximum amount of survival space. Now, this is a cutaway of the first 3 levels: exercise and fitness, what's called science and storage, and I'll get into that in a second, and then finally the EVA and quarter deck. And we'll describe that in a moment as well. But I like a lot of the ideas here, especially the whole science and storage level, but we'll get to that in a moment. First, let's talk about fitness. Obviously, this is going to be an important point for all of the settlers, at least 2 hours worth of workout time for every settler. And given that they're going to be sharing living space, they're going to be sharing equipment as well. Now, assuming that the 6 exercise machines depicted were in constant use 24 hours a day, they would easily be able to accommodate 2 hours worth of exercise for each crewman. As a matter of fact, probably more exercise for those who remain more active, more of the active type of crew, astronauts as opposed to settlers. And then you can also see that the washing areas, toilets, and that sort of thing are also included on this level, maximizing use of space. And nowhere do I think is this principle more obvious than in what's called the science and storage area. Now, this may not seem all that exciting, but an extensive amount of storage, from food to water to equipment, all of these things are going to be absolutely vital to the functioning of Starship. And that large central area, well, it isn't just for science experiments if you were in the mood. It can also be used as a critical medical bay. Now, granted, complex surgery in space is almost impossible because of microgravity, but nevertheless, there's going to be certain situations that come up that are going to require medical attention, and this is the perfect deck for it. So it serves for storage, and it also serves to save the lives of colonists should that become necessary during the trip. And then finally, you have the airlock and the EVA suits, and perhaps even a rover, although I think that might be a little optimistic, but nevertheless, it all depends on how efficiently you use space otherwise. More storage down here, which is going to be absolutely critical, along with life support equipment. Essentially, this is the equipment slash airlock bay. And as you can see, there's only 6 spacesuits, but you don't need that many EVA suits, even if you have 36 crew members. Because remember, you don't need to transfer all of the settlers at the same time. There are habitats with fresh food and oxygen, everything else they're going to need, including additional EVA suits at the habitats. So they can transfer 6 settlers at a time until everybody has disembarked from the ship. So here's a couple of considerations. First of all, you have this long tube essentially connecting the different levels, at least most of them, that seems to be empty space. Now, of course, you need a route to go from level to level. You don't need ladders or anything, but does it really need to be this wide? Well, I think it could actually be used for something besides just passage. Now, here it's used also, at least in part, for a radiation shield, but it could also be used as a hanging garden. There's actually about 70 square meters worth of space around this cylinder that could be used for hydroponics or aeroponics, something along those lines, in order to recycle the atmosphere. Now, this amount of space is not nearly enough to recycle the carbon dioxide from 36 people, but it would certainly help reduce the amount of oxygen you would have to bring along. And as I mentioned before, the Melissa system being introduced by the ESA is using different types of bacteria, mosses, lichens, etc., things that take up a lot less space and require a lot less water in order to produce oxygen. In my opinion, we can improve the recycling rate of oxygen by using these types of systems to maybe 60 or 70%. And that's important because the amount of oxygen you need is pretty staggering. How much? Well, for 36 people, we're talking 16.3 metric tons for a 6 month journey. That's ridiculous, something that we definitely need to be working on. And plants are the perfect solution. They do require energy, light, that sort of thing, but more light efficient plants, water efficient plants are better solutions, of course, and they produce nitrogen as well as oxygen. Fortunately, you can put the oxygen in a place that doesn't count against your 100-ton payload, and that's right here in the header tank. You also may notice that this system has an elevator built into it to carry not only the astronauts, but also a rover, assuming that you can build that into the mass requirements, all the way down to the Martian surface. This is, of course, only one of many designs, but no matter what we come up with, it's all going to have to involve cutting edge, bleeding edge, really, technology. Now, it's also going to require multiple starships. If one gets in trouble, the other can dock with it to provide them with the supplies that they need in order to make the journey. But also, everything that I've described is for a one-way journey. No way is this ship going to have enough supplies to return. So these people that are going to be taking this first trip to the Red Planet are going to be taking massive risks indeed. So, look, I want to make one thing perfectly clear. I acknowledge there are many different ideas and many different concepts that, could very well work every bit as well and, possibly better than what I put forward here. But in my opinion, when we're talking about trying to maximize space, when you're talking, for example, about an army base or something along those lines. You don't have individual cabins for, each soldier. On your average naval ship, you don't have individual cabins for anybody except the officers. The rank and file crew, they are all pretty much packed together. And I do believe that that is going to have to be the case on Starship as well. And I also believe that that is, pretty much the case on the ISS. If, as you saw in the video, the space that ISS astronauts get to themselves, so to speak, is really not much at all. And I think that that is going to be absolutely crucial because they're going to need, as you saw in the video, a hell of a lot of food. And, if you're going to have an efficient use of life support and atmosphere, it's best to have the maximum amount of plant life on board. I'm hoping that, my idea of using the whole central column, the central passageway rather, on Starship also is sort of a hanging garden of sorts, as I described it. I don't know. I hope you guys like that idea. I'd be interested to see your opinion. Something that could provide not only some fresh produce, not a lot, but some fresh produce for the astronauts, but also, recycling atmosphere and providing that vital nitrogen element to the atmosphere, in addition to oxygen, making things a whole lot safer on board. And, also the concept of reusing that main common area. A lot of people look upon that as a waste of space. I think that it's going to be absolutely vital, given the fact that people are going to be crammed together like sardines most of the time. Having that common area with a magnificent view out onto space, and preferably as Mars gets closer in the viewfinder, their destination starts to get larger in their perspective. I think that that will be a remarkable experience for our future Martian settlers. So I strongly believe that that big window and that big common area, that should stay for the psychiatric well-being of people on board, but it can also be used as a flight deck slash takeoff deck. It can multiple purposes, multiple uses for the same space wherever possible. Starship may seem big, but once you start putting dozens of people on board, it gets a lot smaller. If you like what I talk about, if you like to hear my opinions, or if you just like to disagree with them, you know how to support me. It's all in the description, many different ways, including now a way, if everything's worked out, that is, a way to become a member through YouTube if you wish. It's kind of an entry level membership to the Angry Astronaut, an angry advocate, as I tried to call it. We'll see if YouTube has approved that. But there are, of course, I would prefer, going through the Patreon method and such. I'd like that system a lot better, for a variety of different reasons. But nonetheless, you guys are welcome any way you want to come into the family, or if you just want to throw me a like and a subscribe, I would be very grateful. So until somebody comes up with the best way of transporting the maximum number of settlers to the red planet in order to make us into a multiplanetary species, and to do so both safely and reliably, I urge all of you to stay angry about space.